we think that wind is a solution of consensus that can be used in the negotiation. Every country in the world has an interest in developing wind energy, being job creation, industry development, cheap access to energy, etc. And first of all, definitely, the fight against climate change. So this is one step in all the actions we will have to prepare this Paris Agreement. And now let me present you the statement that we decided to call SolutionWind. First, we thought that we absolutely need to accelerate the energy transition. I think you all know the weight of the energy sector in GHG emissions. And definitely, wind energy is a very, very easy way to solve this problem. Definitely does not emit emission, it's cheap, and it can go quick. Then, it creates jobs, and it's very often the second question is it economically viable? It is, definitely. And in some countries, it's already the cheapest source of electricity. One of the questions we wanted to address as well is many countries, there's lots of emissions from the energy sector, but still, in lots of countries, there's still a lack of access to energy, and obviously to electricity even more. And we do think that wind energy can solve part of the problem. And also, it's a small part of the problem, but it's not such small part of the problem, because a very recent report of the International Energy Agency told us that by 2030, between 17 to 19% of the world energy consumption could come from wind energy. So we are ambitious, and we want you to be ambitious with us. So now, we would like to call on all parties to recognize the opportunities that wind energy brings. Then we call on them to submit ambitious national contributions and then translate these national contributions into national targets and obviously also to reach them. The parties need also to engage with investors. I mean, financing the energy transition is key to fighting against climate change. Then fostering partnership between the public and the private sector will also be very important. And finally, we also would like to call on parties to promote policy programs and policy options that make this possible. And now I would like to thank you, all the national associations who already have signed the statement. They are coming from 5 continents. So I would like to thank the association from Brazil, from Canada, from Chile, from China, from Australia, the European Wind Energy Association, my own association, the French Wind Energy Association, Steve's association, the Global Wind Energy Association, the association also from India, from Japan, South Korea, Mexico, New Zealand, South Africa, and Ukraine. And let me tell you, this is just a start. Thank you. Maybe.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much, Sonia. Before we start with questions, I want Joël to outline a little bit about the campaign that we intend to run over the next 12 months in the run-up to Paris. Joël.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you all for being here with us this afternoon. I'd like to start a bit with the bigger picture and then zoom into the campaign that we have launched here today. Whatever is going to happen in the negotiations outside this room, I think we can be pretty sure that it's very likely that countries need to come up with their intended nationally determined contributions in 2015. This process provides all parties, but in particular emerging economies, with a great window of opportunity. A window of opportunity to move away from fossil fuels and enter a new era in which they power their economies with clean power. Because why would you invest in infrastructure and fossil assets that you need to phase out in the near to medium term anyway? For these countries, emerging economies, moving straight to wind energy would spur economic growth, bring electricity to remote areas, and increase the standard of living for millions of people who are yet to switch their lights on. We can also make the case for Europe, which is importing a lot of its energy, and as the IEA rightly pointed out, it needs to diversify its supplies and decarbonize its power system to reach the 40% GHG target that was agreed in October by heads of state and government. But to make this energy transition possible, this fundamental transition possible, governments need to come up with a set of global, political, and national commitments that are backed by stable and long-term policies. Only that will win over investors and show that governments are serious about decarbonizing our economy. And this is where I would like to come to the global campaign SolutionWind. As confirmed in many reports, wind energy is ready to take over, but we are not there yet. And it is the campaign's goal to characterize the unique characteristics of wind energy. That it's the most cost-effective option, that it represents a major driver of economic growth, that it's a major driver for electrification, both in grid-connected and remote areas, and that it plays a major role in helping countries and regions to achieve energy security and reduce their dependence on fossil fuel imports. To convince all parties to join the clean industrial revolution, we will ensure that negotiators from all parties get to know the facts. We will engage with the global business community and include the general public. We start here today in Lima, and we will finish next year in about 353 days on the Champs-Élysées in Paris. I thank you for your attention.
Okay. I'm not going to add a lot to that because we don't have a lot of time, other than to say two things. One is just to play out the logic a little bit of what this process needs to do if we're going to meet any of our long-term climate or short-term climate objectives, and certainly the long ones, is that if there is going to preserve any reasonable possibility of keeping global mean temperature rise below 2 degrees C, or, as some parties prefer, below 1.5 degrees C, then emissions need to peak and begin to decline before the end of this decade. Now, if you look at the profile of emissions, you see that from the power sector, about 40% of CO2-related emissions and about 25% of overall greenhouse gases originate in the power sector. If we are going to make significant changes to that number in the short term or the medium term in a cost-effective fashion and in a way that is physically possible, then there's really only three things that we can do between now and 2020, and not a lot more in the decade beyond. The first of these, of course, is efficiency. Efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. And we have two places in the world where they've had major GDP growth over the last 2 or 3 decades without any increase in primary energy consumption. That's Denmark and the state of California. The whole rest of the developed world needs to learn from them, because the developing economies in the world their primary energy consumption will continue to grow, even though we hope we can do that in a less carbon-intensive manner. The second thing, which is happening in some places, is use more efficient and switch fossil fuels from coal to gas. In some places that makes sense as a short-term measure, but in the long run, gas emits significant quantities of CO2. And then the third thing, and the largest one that will have an impact on the supply side, of course, is the accelerated deployment of renewables. In the time frame we're talking about, that means hydro, wind power, and more after 2020 than now, solar power. I mean, all the solar and wind are the fastest growing technologies. Solar is coming from a very small base. It's growing very, very rapidly. But in emissions terms, it's going to make its greatest impact after 2020. So that's the challenge that we're faced with. We're in a position to play our part. We see enormous growth in wind and solar technologies in a variety of different parts of the world, but it needs to be more universal. The second thing is that in these negotiations and in the discussions that have been going on within these hallowed walls for the last 25 years, every single analysis of how this challenge of keeping global mean temperature rise below 2 degrees or addressing it at all is going to need to be financed somewhere between 75 and 90% by the private sector. So far in these negotiations running up to Paris, we've seen precious little about how the parties intend to do that. They spend an awful lot of time and energy talking about the 10 to maximum 25% of the money that governments are going to provide. And I think the reality will be a lot closer to the 10% than the 25%, given the state of the balance sheets of the OECD countries. But almost no time talking about how they are going to influence us, which in the end of the day is what they need to do. So we're hoping to remind them continuously between now and Paris that they better start taking that issue seriously, and if they're not going to have a carbon market, a global carbon market a la the Kyoto Protocol, then what is the alternative and how are we to play our part? So with that, I will conclude and ask if there are any questions from the floor. I believe we have microphones somewhere so the people listening on the web can hear. Gentleman with the microphone is right there. Lady in the front has first, and then lady with the sunglasses on her head behind. And please identify yourself and your affiliation.
My name's Judy Sull. I'm filming for South African television. Could you please just compare wind and sun against the traditional energy sources, for time it takes to install, say, 1 megawatt, and price, and how long they last without any further, without any further input of money?
Shall I, or do you want to?
Please.
Well, for both wind and solar, as well as for fossil fuels, in order to give you an accurate answer to that question, the first question you have to ask is where. Since you're from South Africa, we'll take South Africa, where, as you know, the first build-out of commercial-scale wind and solar is underway right now. We'll have somewhere between 600 or 800 megawatts of wind spinning by the end of the year and a similar amount of solar PV. The initial prices for that, and these were as a result of projects which were first announced as preferred bidders at Cancun in 2010, and then they reached financial close. It took another 2 years. So from the time that the bureaucracy was finished with its permitting process to actually build the plants is somewhere between 1 and 2 years. And it can be faster or slower depending on regulatory things. But the physical construction of a megawatt scale wind farm or PV farm, the actual building part, it generally takes less than a year. The permitting, financing, all the other things can take from 1 year to 10 years. In the UK, if you're trying to get planning permission to put up a wind farm in some Tory Squires district, it might take you 30 years to get permission. But once you've got that, it's very fast to deploy, and that's one of the major advantages of wind and, of course, solar. In terms of cost, again, it depends very much on the available resource. And because South Africa has opted for a bidding system, and it was a brand new market, the first prices were, for the first round, were, say, comparable with new build coal prices. For the second round, the prices that have been agreed are somewhere around 20% less. And I can tell you that the third round projects, the prices for wind are about half of what the new power plant at Medupe is going to cost in terms of electricity, per kilowatt hour. So the prices will be somewhere around 6 rand per kilowatt hour, and it's 11 or so for Medupe. So, well, that's a very specific situation. South Africa is blessed with very good wind resources and lots of really good sun. And the country and the economy, and particularly the power system, has been in a difficult stage of development, shall we say, to put it mildly, over the course of the last decade or so, or two. And every other situation is going to be different. But in an increasing number of markets around the globe, and I can speak about Brazil, Argentina, parts of China, most of the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Turkey, Morocco, elsewhere, wind at the moment is the cheapest way to generate electricity when you're comparing new builds.
If I can just add one point.
I can't. Oh, well, compared to with solar, the only place that I know that ground-mounted solar is cheaper than wind is in the Atacama Desert in northern Peru, where they don't have really good, very great wind. They have okay wind, but the sun is just about perfect. So in technology, costs, again, it depends very much on where you are. If you're in Denmark, wind has you beat hands down. If you're in Arizona or the Atacama Desert, then the prices are getting relatively comparative. In Brazil and South Africa at the moment, the wind still has quite a significant cost advantage. But the advantage that solar has, of course, is that there's the option there to mount it on your house if you have a grid system that can handle it, and then you're competing with the wholesale price of electricity, or the retail price of electricity, rather than the wholesale price. And that's really solar's main commercial advantage nowadays.
Yeah, just one addition. I think it's very important to remind ourselves that we can't have only wind, we can't have only solar, we can't have only hydroelectricity. We need a diversified mix because all this energy do not have the same characteristics, they do not produce at the same time, and we need to mix them to be able to have always energy when we need it.
Lady in the back.
Sorry,
Oh, sorry, go
if
ahead.
I can just add something maybe from the European context. Those who are saying that wind is expensive, they've had to deal with a trilogy of horror stories the last months. First of all, the IEA confirmed that wind can compete. Second of all, the Overseas Development Institute highlighted the enormous amount of subsidies that go to fossil fuels and said that $1 in investment in renewables means $2.50 in private investments, whereas for fossil fuels, $1 in subsidies only attracts $1.3 in private investments. And then finally, European Commission, in its subsidies report that came out in October, clearly said that onshore wind is the cheapest technology when you look at all subsidies, pollution, and all costs for taxpayers and consumers. It makes onshore wind cheaper, cheaper than gas, cheaper than nuclear, and cheaper than coal. And coal, if you add in the externalities, would even be more expensive than offshore wind, which is still a technology that is developing. So I think the tide is out on the real cost of energy, and we can now finally see who's swimming naked. And that makes mentality shifting.
There was another question at the back. Yeah.
Pelita Clark, Financial Times. I wonder if you could comment on the likely impact of a prolonged period of low oil prices on the wind industry, please.
On the whole, I think it will have the places where it will have an impact is in the stock market. In terms of, we've already seen some of the wind companies taking a little bit of a hit as a result of this. In the marketplace, it's not going to really have any effect at all because we don't actually compete with oil. Now, there are some markets where the gas price is in fact tied to the oil price still to some extent. That's certainly no longer the case in the United States, and it only is to a limited degree in Europe, but there are some markets where it's the case. So as and when there is evidence that the results will include a decrease in the gas price, it might have an effect. But on the whole, as a matter of practicality, we don't compete with oil to generate electricity simply because 25 years ago there was a substantial amount of our electricity generated with oil, but now it's a very, very small percentage. And in the places where it would be most prevalent would be in off-grid situations where we're talking about diesel gensets in rural Africa or South America or developing Asia. And even with oil at $30 a barrel, we'd be very, very competitive, much, much cheaper than a diesel-fired genset for a rural application. But that level analysis is not usually what you encounter at stock market analysts, so I know some of my turbine suppliers are nervous about this reduction in the oil price. But the only thing that we know is that the change in oil price is yet another reflection of a significant advantage that both wind and solar and other renewable energies have, the ones that aren't dependent upon fuel. And that when you sign a contract for a 20-year PPA with a wind farm or a solar plant or whatever, you know what the price is now, you know what the price is going to be 5 years from now, you know what the price is going to be 15 years from now, and you know what it's going to be for 20 years now. And this is to get back to your other question, which I didn't answer before. I'm sorry. The design life of the commercial wind and solar installations going in now is 20 years. The actual life that we have found from the early wind plants, at any rate, that were installed in the 90s is that they're 20 years old and they're still doing just fine. Of course, the technology has moved on so much that replacing them now, in many instances, makes economic sense. But yeah, the original design life for these things is these power plants is 20 years. Do you want to add to that?
Well, I don't have much to add to that. I concur with what Steve said on the low oil prices.
1 minute
this
before we have to get out of here, so we can get another question.
We might see an increased demand for oil, and that might, make prices very volatile. And as Steve said, investors don't like that. They want stability. And when you look at fossil fuel assets and compare it to renewables, renewables is where the good stories are, where the good news is. It goes from strength to strength, and therefore it might might make investors switch more to renewables rather than staying in the very volatile market for fossil fuels. Thank you.
Gentlemen here, we have time for one more. Then we have to vacate, I believe, for the next event.
Thank you. I'm Gustavo Arnizou from Brazil 24/7 online vehicle. I would like you to just briefly explain what's the context of these wind prospects for Brazil specifically. I've heard from Eletrobras yesterday that we have a 5 megawatts to come into force in the next years, but of course there is a prevalence of hydro in Brazil. And how much have you influenced the negotiators, and how do you see the Brazilian position in this forum here?
Well, that's a complicated question, and I don't think I can do it justice in a minute, other than to say that for the wind energy industry, Brazil is now one of the real bright spots in the world. We're expecting installations in 2014 of about 3.5 gigawatts, which will constitute a 100% increase in their cumulative installed capacity. And the current 5-year plan that's put out by EPE, the agency that advises the Brazilian Energy Ministry, calls for somewhere around 20 to 22 gigawatts by 2022. And statements repeatedly over the past few years that that wind will be the #2 source of energy in Brazil after hydro. But as you know, when the power crisis from 10 years ago and the sort of tight reserve margins that we had just last year, Brazil has very long relied on its very good hydro resources, but both demand growth in Brazil and changes in the hydrology due to both local reasons and global climate change means that the hydro in Brazil is not going to be as reliable as it once was. So Brazil needs more energy. Wind energy is far and away the cheapest way to supply that now, and I think it has a very good and a strong future. And I can see from my friend over here that we're out of time. And thank you all for coming, and we'll be outside afterwards if you have any other questions. Thanks very much.